Hello, welcome to Being Reintegrated. This is Tim Wright. So I am super happy to offer to the subscribers of the Illuminism of Genesis library a book called The Emerald Mind. Um, and what I did is I wrote an introduction to this. And the reason why it's being offered on the Omni Channel Genesis series is because it requires access to alchemy and Genesis. So I wanted to be able to offer that for inexpensive if you're not the type that wants to have a massive library on this esoteric material that we're covering. So you can go to omnishelf.org and you'll see the Illuminism and Genesis, or Illuminism of Genesis library there. It's subscription, so you'll need to subscribe to it, but it's super inexpensive, so you'll have access to all these materials. The Emerald Mind, which you'll see again up there, is a new book that I did based on a lecture from Giles Quispel. I was lucky enough to be reading a scholarly book, and it dawned on me the key to alchemy. He gives it away very subtly, but he doesn't quite tell you what he's doing. He just dates the not the Corpus Hermeticum, but the Emerald Tablet with this particular kind of idea. So I said, okay, he's a scholar. He knows way more than I do. So I went through the Emerald Tablet and I found that it's a key to every one of the phrases. Every one of the phrases is what are called a parallelism. And then I go into, in the Emerald Mind, a pretty lengthy explanation of what exactly the benefit of a parallelism is for today's psychology and today's esoteric practitioner. So we're going to where it's never been gone before, not to talk about some kind of space stuff, but the truth is that the Emerald Tablet is allowing us to break into a kind of healing mode that wasn't previously available. So the Emerald Mind does that, and in it I analyzed every one of the alchemy and Genesis quotes, which is from a very esoteric source called the Concordance. And I use that concordance for Genesis because I'm trying to link in all this stuff with the esoteric thinking of Illuminism of Genesis, which is basically an ideographic commentary on every word of the first 10 chapters, which is said to be part of the priests of Ezra. So there's a lot that goes behind this stuff. Well, the Emerald Tablet is also dated to around the 1st to the 4th century AD, Anno Domini. And so what happens is this material ties perfectly into the concordance because it's an alchemy conversation. It's kind of a key to alchemy. I could keep blabbing on and on and on, but there's a lot of ground for what I said in that book. So you can go ahead and grab that. I'm really happy to be able to present it, though, because I can read the introduction to you, so you won't be without the information. I expanded the introduction that I originally wrote, so this one's pretty good. Maybe you can tell me your criticism of it. It's pretty long, so I'll just read it during this video so you can get a semblance of what this particular material is going to do. In the earlier volume of Alchemy and Genesis, part of the Illuminism of Genesis series, I explored how the phrases drawn from the French work known as the Concordance could be mapped carefully and deliberately onto the first 10 chapters of Genesis. This mapping was not undertaken as an idle academic exercise, but with the serious intention of demonstrating that alchemical thought is not a foreign intrusion upon sacred scripture, but an interpretive key. a kind of philosophical midrash that reveals a deep compatibility between the transformational narrative of alchemy and the cosmogonic myth of Genesis itself. The act of mapping these phrases was a hermeneutical operation, an alchemical solve and coagula applied to text. In that work, the reader was invited to see the process of Genesis not merely as a historical or mythological account, but as an unfolding alchemical opus, with the division of light and darkness, the separation of waters above and below, and the formation of Adam all understood as the symbolic stages of the great work. But what I never anticipated, at least not consciously, was that through this method I would stumble upon what I have come to call the emerald mind. This concept emerged not as a pre-planned thesis, but as a discovery that forced itself upon me. An idea that revealed itself slowly, like the colors developing in an alchemical vessel. The emerald mind is, for me, the key to understanding alchemy itself. Not as a dusty collection of laboratory tricks or cryptic symbols, but as a living psychology, an epistemology of transformation that allows the practitioner to see the entire world, including the text of Genesis, as alive with potentiality, waiting to be read, interpreted, and ultimately redeemed. It is this understanding that forms the foundation for the present work and that demands a further expansion beyond the original Genesis-centered study. While these original entries remain in that book as a testament to the first phase of this inquiry, the present volume, The Emerald Mine, represents an intentional expansion and deepening of that earlier project. It broadens the conversation well beyond the narrative confines of Genesis, pushing into what I see as a necessary restoration of balance and the way the mind categorizes and comprehends reality. If alchemy in Genesis was about drawing a set of symbolic parallels between biblical cosmogony and alchemical processes, the Emerald Mine is about stepping back to examine the very framework of understanding that makes such parallels meaningful. It is about recognizing that the human mind itself is an alchemical vessel, one capable of both division and union, of creating separations through analysis and achieving wholeness through synthesis. This work asks the reader not merely to look at ancient texts or symbols, but to turn inward, to examine the processes of categorization and judgment that shape perception and belief. The Emerald Mine is not just a metaphor for a specific reading of the Emerald Tablet, but a call to cultivate a kind of thinking that can hold opposites without reducing them, that can see the many without forgetting the one. It is an invitation to recover what might be called the alchemical habitus, a disposition of mind that balances analysis and synthesis, criticism and compassion, intellect and intuition. In this sense, the project is not merely exegetical or historical, but transformative, aimed at healing the fractured epistemology of modern consciousness. The restoration I speak of is not a nostalgic return to pre-critical naivety, but a deliberate, disciplined integration of what analysis has divided, a reunion of the scattered fragments into a living, dynamic whole. I was reading Giles Quispell's commentary of the Tabula Smaragdina, known in English as the Emerald Tablet, when something remarkable dawned on me, something that would change the entire course of this work. The Emerald Tablet is not merely a cryptic relic of ancient wisdom, a series of enigmatic phrases to be coded like a cipher. It is, in fact, an articulated rebus, a deliberate linguistic and philosophical structure that enacts the very union of opposites it describes. Quispell himself referring to this structuring as parallelism, noting how its phrases echo the rhetorical patterns found in early Christian writings, which often employed the two into one formations to express unity emerging from division. He traced these patterns across the vast corpus of ancient literature, showing that this technique was not an isolated invention, but part of a broad cultural grammar for thinking about reconciliation, wholeness, and transformation. Yet, as I read Quispell's careful scholarly exposition, I found myself understanding it in a way he only gestured toward. For me, parallelism was not merely a rhetorical device or literary convention. It was a living key to the alchemical art itself. It was not just a structure of language, but a model of consciousness, a map for the psyche's work of integration. The phrases of the Emerald Tablet do not simply describe the work of turning two into one. They enact it. They perform it in the very rhythm and balance of their construction. The insight struck me with the force of revelation. What if these ancient formulations were not dead artifacts, but living instructions, a kind of performative magic that, when internalized, could transform the reader's own cognitive patterns? What if they offered a technique, not just for understanding alchemy, but for becoming alchemical in one's very mode of thought? That question is what set this book in motion. As I reflected on Quispell's words and the profound implications of his analysis, my mind recognized an immense opportunity, one that felt both daunting and urgently necessary. The book you now hold is the fruit of that realization, a document designed to help Charaxio guide you toward healing. What I offer here is not a rigid system of thought or a new dogma to replace old ones, but an invitation to enter into a relationship with the living principle of unification. Through engaging with this meta-narrative technique, what Quispell so precisely called parallelism, we gain a method for introducing into our thinking the figure of the rebus or androgyne, that ancient symbol of integration. This is no small shift. It is a way of reorienting the very architecture of the mind, cultivating the capacity to hold dualities together without forcing them into false resolution or sterile synthesis. The rebus or androgyne stands at the center of alchemical symbolism precisely because it embodies the union of opposites that is the heart of the great work. In classical imagery, the rebus appears as an androgynous figure crowned with both the sun and the moon, one half male and one half female, holding instruments that signal mastery over both spirit and matter. It does not erase difference, but sanctifies it within unity. When I speak of inviting this rebus into our mental processes, I am suggesting something deeper than metaphor, a disciplined epistemological transformation that makes us aware of how our categories divide, exclude, and privilege one side over another. In some traditions, this rebus has been envisioned as an angel, a being who mediates between the human and the divine, between what is fragmented and what is whole. To invite such a presence into thought is to open oneself to what the English occult tradition calls the knowledge and conversation, a profound and ongoing dialogue with the transpersonal intelligence. Even if one understands this angelic presence metaphorically, the practice remains powerful. It offers the mind a way to rest through structured categorization and focused activity, allowing for a dynamic balance between analysis and synthesis, where categories are no longer prisons, but tools for perceiving connections. This invitation is not to abandon thought, but to refine it. It is to suggest that true rest for the mind comes not from shutting down its critical faculties, but from training them to see their own limits and open themselves to the possibility of integration. The Emerald Mind is not a doctrine to be accepted on faith, but a practice to be enacted, a living, evolving conversation with the greater whole that recognizes opposites not as threats to be suppressed, but as partners in the alchemical dance of becoming whole. The goal here is what I call the epistemological Eucharist, a sacred operation a sacred operation of the intellect itself, mixing bread with wine, turning two into one, in the very act of knowing. This metaphor suggests not merely the fusion of disparate elements, but their transformation into something new and nourishing, a sacrament of thought. Importantly, the Eucharist of this method isn't about losing or dissolving the original materials, but about creating a third, an outward symbol of the soul's work, and a model for how the upper and lower chariots are both necessary for a complete vehicle capable of traveling the spheres of Hermetic cosmic philosophy. The mind is able to use the upper chariot, which corresponds to Jung's dominance, archetypal forms and organizing principles, and synthesize this with the lower chariot, the energetic residue of the planets, or what the Hermetic literature calls dynamis. The union is not an obliteration of difference, but the creation of a more complex, integrated mode of being and knowing. Just as the alchemical process refines and perfects raw materials into philosopher's stone, so too does this approach refine the mind's categories, revealing them not as final truths, but as provisional tools capable of creative synthesis. In the phrases and meter of the Emerald Tablet, we see this process performed for us. Each aphorism is a carefully balanced structure of opposites, a linguistic demonstration of the very unity it proclaims. By learning to link these in forms, what Quispo called parallelisms, we cultivate a mental habit of reconciliation, a capacity to hold difference without division, to see contradiction as invitation rather than threat. Quispo provided ample evidence for this interpretive technique, tracing its use across early Christian writings and Hermetic tradition, showing how these traditions developed a shared language of two into one to express their deepest mysteries. He even noted that this technique was particularly popular in Chem, spelled Khme, or as I prefer to call it, Khem, Khem, the ancient name for Egypt, whose esoteric literature were famed for the mastery of symbolic thinking and sacred speech. This is not incidental detail, but essential context. It places the Emerald Tablet in a lineage of wisdom literature that used structured, balanced language not merely to communicate ideas, but to shape consciousness itself. To read these texts is to participate in a training of the mind, to rehearse the very movement of integration they describe. What I'm proposing in the Emerald Mind is not a new dogma, but a discipline, a way of approaching language, symbolism, and thought that resists the modern tendency to analyze to death without returning to synthesis. It is a practice of remembering that categories are not ultimate realities, but interpretive tools. That meaning is not found in reduction, but in the dynamic interplay of opposites. This epistemological Eucharist is nothing less than the restoration of sacred thinking, a recognition that true wisdom lies not in choosing between bread or wine, body or spirit, analysis or synthesis, but in learning how to commune with both at once. In Ion, C.G. Jung argues that we have lost our original language, the mythic, symbolic speech that once wove together the realms of reason and the irrational conscious and unconscious. He saw this symbolic mode not as a childish fantasy to be outgrown, but as the essential connective tissue of the psyche, a language capable of mediating between the known and the unknown, the personal and the transpersonal. Modernity, in its zeal for clarity and utility, has systematically dismantled this symbolic consciousness through the forces of epistemological critique and reductionist rationalism. We have built for ourselves a language that prides itself on precision, but that cannot speak to the depth of mystery. In the process, we have excluded the mystical and the numinous, stripping them of legitimacy and banishing them to the margins of superstition or pathology. What I call Charaxio is an attempt to reclaim this lost territory. Charaxio is not merely a term, but a living concept, a symbolic being or aeon that represents the principle of integration. Others have called it Abraxas, or simply the rebus, names that point to its nature as a force or intelligence that holds opposites together without erasing their distinctiveness. Originally, it was not foreign to see the divine as two in one. This was the original meaning of the Elohim, which the Bible often translates simply as God. The Elohim were understood as a syzygy, or paired or twin principle working together to manifest the fullness of that dyad. This idea would later be elaborated by Kabbalists into the concept of Eshmaim, the unification of fire and water, symbolizing the integration of opposing cosmic forces into creative harmony. Charaxio is the awareness that integration is not achieved by suppressing difference, but by learning to live with it creatively, dynamically, even reverently. It is the refusal to flatten complexity for the sake of false clarity. Our modern analytical vocabulary is an epistemological attack on reality itself, enforcing rigid dualities that carve the world into competing camps: mind versus body, spirit versus matter, subject versus object, us versus them. This habit of the mind becomes a self reinforcing prison. Faced with unbearable tension of these divisions, we numb ourselves in various ways, through literal intoxication or through the seductive lull of tautological reasoning that pretends to resolve the split while only reinforcing it. To invoke Charaxio is to name the possibility of healing this split, to imagine a new practice of mind that does not run from duality, but engages it consciously, transforming it from conflict into creative tension. It is an invitation to remember that the mind itself can be alchemical, capable of transmuting division into communion. Interestingly, Quispel's own analysis reveals both the power and the subtle limits of his approach. In tracing the parallelisms of the Emerald Tablet, he often brought in Christian theological categories, attempting to frame these Hermetic teachings within a familiar doctrinal context. On one hand, this was a natural move for a scholar shaped by Western intellectual traditions, eager to explain these ancient patterns of two into one by showing the resonance with the Christian mystery of incarnation and reconciliation. Yet in doing so, Quispel inadvertently exposed something even deeper: a need to confront the Gnostic themes that Christianity itself has long wrestled with and often rejected. His study becomes, in a way, a testament to this buried struggle within the Western mind, the tension between dogma and mystery, between defined creed and the open-ended work of integration. For me, the Emerald Tablet does not merely illustrate Christian ideas, but offers a method that transcends any single religious framework. It shows us how the mind has a tendency to turn one into two, to dissect and divide reality into opposites: light and dark, good and evil, spirit and matter, not simply to clarify, but often to dominate and control. This splitting is a necessary function of intellect, but it becomes pathological when it loses sight of its complement. This dynamic finds a powerful parallel in the teachings of Isaac Luria, as introduced through Chaim Vital. The doctrine of the shattering of the vessels, Sheverat HaKalim, was not taught to suggest we are incapable of holding the universe within ourselves, but to show that God required other categories to express the nuance of his attributes. The biblical narratives in this reading become parables for these dynamics within the often over-intellectualized realm of the Sephirat. Humanity is not simply fallen or broken. Our so-called fall represents the use of these shattered vessels so they are not lost. The mind becomes the receptacle for these unintegrated, not fully self-defined categories, which must borrow from one another to express meaning. This borrowing creates the necessity for individuality to integrate and balance with others, yet its inability to do so fully leads to a shattering, a psychic fragmentation that demands conscious work to repair. Quispel himself, in his introduction to the Smaragdina, acknowledges that this splitting is not the final word. He argues for the need of a method, a disciplined practice, to turn two back into one. This is not about abolishing difference, but about restoring relationship. It is about recognizing that knowledge is not the conquest of mystery, but the cultivation of communion with it. This practice of reintegration is, I believe, the key to alchemy itself. Alchemy has always been more than a proto-chemistry or symbolic art. It is a discipline of the mind and soul that seeks to repair what has been fragmented. It insists that transformation is not imposed from without, but emerges from within. Through the careful balancing of opposites, the conscious orchestration of tensions, the acceptance of ambiguity as a space of creative potential. By learning to think alchemically to adopt the structure of parallelism as a way of understanding, we do not erase dualities but make them transparent to their deeper unity. This is the great work of the Emerald Mind, to offer not another doctrine to be memorized, but a method to be practiced, a path of healing for the modern mind split by its own overreaching certainty. Finding such a key, I turned back to the Alchemy and Genesis material with new eyes, applying the method of parallelism not as a purely academic tool, but as an operative key, a genuine alchemical device for unlocking meaning. What I discovered astonished me. In each phrase of the concordance, I could detect the shape of one of the 14 parallelisms derived from Fulcanelli's version of the Emerald Tablet. It was as if these cryptic entries were not random observations or disconnected symbols, but intentional parallels encoding a grammar of transformation. Each phrase presented itself as a distillation of opposites, a dynamic tension that could only be resolved through conscious integration. To see this was like suddenly recognizing the outline of a buried temple in the pattern of old stones scattered across the field. What seemed fragmentary and opaque took on the structure of a design teaching, an initiation text hiding in plain sight. The brilliance of Fulcanelli's version of the Emerald Tablet is that it explicitly includes will as one of its key parallelisms. This is a revolutionary concept because will itself is revealed as an entity of dual nature. It confronts us with the ancient tension found in the words, "Not mine, but thy will be done," a phrase that acknowledges the split between personal desire and higher purpose. Fulcanelli's inclusion of will as a formal parallelism offers a way to read this tension not as an irreconcilable contradiction, but as a polarity requiring conscious integration. This insight could even provoke an answer to the Diophysite conundrum that sparked fierce debate in early Christian councils over the two natures of Christ. Rather than treating divine and human wills as mutually exclusive, this method suggests that they are complementary aspects that must be harmonized. Tragically, centuries later, such unresolved theological splits would harden into theological and ideological schemas applied to secular politics and cultural identity, perpetuating conflict precisely because they lacked a practice for integration. This realization felt like striking gold, but not in the literal or even metaphorical sense of mere value. Rather, it was the philosopher's gold, the inner treasure that alchemy promises to those who learn its language. It was the gold or illumination, the capacity to see connections where before there had only been confusion, to uncover purpose and design in what appeared to be chaotic fragments. The Emerald Tablet had provided not just the content, but form, a model for reading that itself transforms the reader. By matching the 14 parallelisms to concordance, I was not imposing an external scheme, but revealing an underlying architecture of thought that had always been there, waiting to be deciphered. This is why I say we have finally struck gold, because in recognizing this hidden order, we can gain access to the method of integration that is both ancient and urgently modern. We learn that these alchemical phrases are not historical curiosities, but living seeds of wisdom designed to germinate in the soil of the mind. They show us how to think in balance, to hold polarities together without reducing them to dull sameness or destructive conflict. They offer us training in the art of mental reconciliation, an invitation to become alchemists of our own consciousness. And this is the true goal of the Emerald Mind. Not to provide a new dogma to memorize, but to awaken the reader's capacity for creative synthesis, for seeing the world and themselves as a site of perpetual transformation. This book, then, is best understood as an expansion of Alchemy and Genesis, but not merely a sequel or simple continuation. It is a deliberate deepening of the work begun there, an attempt to reveal the principles that underlie the phrases collected in the concordance and to expose what I call the hidden seed of thought, embedded within each of its enigmatic lines. In the earlier volume, the concordance was presented with the explicit purpose of showing alchemy's compatibility with the first 10 chapters of Genesis. inviting the reader to see sacred scripture as a veiled alchemical narrative. That work remains intact and its method remains valid, but here my focus is different. I have chosen not to reprint the entire concordance because this volume is not simply about those phrases as historical curiosities or scholarly objects. Instead, it's about the method that makes sense of them, the interpretive key that allows us to read them alchemically rather than merely catalog them. That key is the parallelism found in the Emerald Tablet, a structure that, when internalized, transforms reading from passive observation to active initiation. By exploring these 14 parallelisms in detail, this book aims to train the reader's mind in a practice of integration, a method of recognizing and reconciling opposites that are otherwise left in conflict or fragmentation. This is not an academic exercise in decoding old symbols for their own sake, but a healing practice, a way to confront what I have called epistemological criticism, the modern habit of endlessly dissecting without restoring, of breaking concepts into ever finer distinctions without returning them to wholeness. This analytical tendency is not simply a method but a worldview, one that has taught us to see difference as opposition and complexity as confusion, leaving the modern mind fragmented, anxious, and alienated from its own integrative powers. The Corpus Hermeticum itself warns of this danger in what it calls the Ginjikoi Logoi, the common reasoning that remains bound to multiplicity, forever parsing and categorizing without rising division. This work is offered as a counter to that tendency, proposing instead a hieratic logoi, a sacred reasoning capable of perceiving unity and multiplicity without erasing difference. The parallelisms of the Emerald Tablet are not simple slogans, but exercises in this higher mode of thought. They teach us how to see the world as fundamentally relational, how to hold contradictions without canceling them, how to recognize that integration is not the erasure of difference, but its transformation into a dynamic whole. In choosing to focus this volume on those parallelisms, I hope to give the reader not another system to memorize, but a practice to inhabit, a way to heal the mind's fragmentation by recovering its original alchemical capacity for creative unity. Finally, each parallelism in this work is not merely explained in the abstract, but analyzed according to its most likely planetary sympathy, an ancient method for mapping the structures of consciousness onto the symbolic architecture of the cosmos. This is not a trivial correspondence game or an exercise in antiquarian curiosity, but a crucial step in Hermetic practice. For the Hermetic tradition has always insisted that the macrocosm and the microcosm reflect one another in precise and meaningful ways. The planetary forces are not simply distant astronomical bodies, but archetypal principles, living intelligences whose movements mirror and influence the subtle structures of the human psyche. To understand a parallelism, planetary sympathy, is to understand the quality of mind it cultivates, the energy it channels, the virtue it seeks to balance and integrate. This mapping is essential because the human mind itself is not a blank slate, but a field of forces, a complex of tendencies, potentials, and latent conflicts. The ancients saw these forces as governed by planetary spirits or dynami, dynamis, shaping inclinations, passions, insights, and moral challenges. By associating each parallelism with its planetary sympathy, this book offers the reader a practical hermeneutic key, a way to recognize these powers within themselves and to learn how to work with them consciously, rather than be governed by them unconsciously. This approach transforms the study of the Emerald Tablet from a purely intellectual pursuit into a psychospiritual discipline, inviting the practitioner to identify the fragmented, conflicting forces in their own mind and to begin the work of deliberate reconciliation. In this way, the Emerald Mind does not merely interpret ancient texts, but revives their intended function as tools of self-knowledge and transformation. It proposes that the mind can be trained, like any instrument, to attune itself to the music of the spheres, to resonate with the planetary virtues not as external authorities but as inner faculties, to be harmonized and integrated. This is the alchemical promise that lies at the heart of Hermetic philosophy, that by understanding the cosmos, we understand ourselves, and by ordering ourselves, we participate in the ordering of the cosmos. This book, therefore, is not offered as a final word or a closed system, but as an invitation to recover an ancient art of thinking, feeling, and imagining that refuses fragmentation, embraces complexity, and seeks always the possibility of creative living unity. So that is the introduction to the Emerald Mind. I hope that was enjoyable for you. I try not to just put things out there that are, marketing tools or anything. That is the full introduction that I wrote to allow you contextualization to why this stuff is so important. We're working on something profoundly awesome here, and I'm so happy to be able to present it to you, the Patreon, all of you on the Omni Shelf, and anybody who purchases any of the volumes of Kim Publishing. Thank you.